I am delighted tonight to present our speaker, Professor Hal Alper. He's a professor of chemical engineering here at the University of Texas, and he leads a research group here that rewires how cells work in order to be able to have them create new chemicals, new next generation fuels, and pharmaceuticals to help human health. They take on this challenge in order to address some global issues, including sustainability, human health, clean energy. So small stuff is what they're tackling. It's just amazing what they've been able to do, and we'll hear about this tonight. But before I bring Hal up here, I just wanted to read off some honors and awards he's won. The Society for Industrial Microbiology and Biotechnology Young Investigator Award, the J. Bailey Young Investigator Award in Metabolic Engineering. He's a Dreyfus Teacher Scholar Award, the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award, the DuPont Young Professor Award, and the Texas Ex's Teaching Award. There's actually a whole bunch of other awards. They just don't say Young Investigator, so I didn't read those off. Hal is, from an early age, apparently, he's been really leading the field as a researcher and as a teacher in this area of STEM, science, technology, and engineering. And even though he's won all the awards and is a leading researcher and teacher in this area, I can also share with you that in all the generations of Hal's family, going all the way back through time, he is the first one in his family to enter the field of STEM. Right? So if you're out there and you're thinking, maybe I should have a career, but I'm not sure if STEM is in my DNA, don't worry about that. It's there, and you can get it if you really want. So please welcome Professor Hal Alper.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that great introduction. I'm glad that you focused on the young part of the young investigators, and very grateful to be able to have a chance to be able to be here today to talk about how we're trying to solve large sustainability problems in bioengineering. Let me switch over to my slide. So really this idea of using biology and using it to solve some grand challenges. So starting to think about this and how we would think about the impact we have on the world is to recognize every single thing that we do leaves a footprint on our planet. Right? So every single thing that we do. Sometimes these footprints are pretty benign and they can be washed away really quickly. Right? Other times, the impacts are much more visible, be it in the way that we make things, the leftovers of the materials that we have, the impact that that has in the environment, and even the end of our clothing gets put away into waste piles. So sometimes this impact is really visible and we can see it. Other times the impact is a lot less visible. So in the idea of things like microplastics or chemicals that get released into the waterways, into our food streams. So at the end of the day, we think about that footprint, that impact that we have, and it's multifaceted. Right? It touches so many different parts. So we really need to think about having a more sustainable process. How do we want to think about sustainable solutions for our planet? And we kind of have a choice. We can choose the green path, or we can choose the much more impactful path, right? That doesn't necessarily have a sustainable future for our planet. So this is really the set of grand challenges and grand problems that we think about in our research. So thinking about this idea of sustainability, we have to start thinking about how we make things, where these things come from. And most of our things come from oil. So there's some footprint on all the molecules that we have, on all the materials that we have, on all the drugs that we use, all come from petroleum resources. This gets dug out of the ground, lots of carbon dioxide gets created because of that, and we make and use all of these things. So clearly that's not a sustainable process. That's not a circular process. So the next thing that people thought of is, well, how can we make this more sustainable? What if we grew these things? Right? What if we made this from plant material? You could take plant material, feed that into cells, and then produce these same molecules. Okay, comes from plants. It sounds like it's going to be green and great, but even that isn't sustainable because each of these things becomes waste. and we have to start the process over again, and we have to put energy into the process, and we have to use water. So better yet, what if we took our trash, the end point of all of these, and had that as the starting point for our next thing? So when we throw that trash away, we can then use that as a starting point to make the next material, the next fuel, the next cosmetic, the next piece of clothing. So this is the main idea of using bioengineering to convert that waste into a treasure, into something that's much more valuable. So what I'll showcase today is how we can use different types of parts of biology, whether it's a whole cell or an enzyme, and use that to bring these waste sources in, so teaching these enzymes and cells to chew up these wastes, and convert that later into a wide range of valuable products. So I'll start off with this idea. How do we actually convert this with things like cells? And you think of this idea of a cell, this is a little microscopic factory, right? This idea that you can actually take some kind of diversity of life and hijack that. Well, cells have metabolism just like we have metabolism. Right? Cells need to eat just like we need to eat. And within that, those cells have a lot of metabolic pathways that consume different types of molecules. So they like to eat basic sugars, like our candy, right? We all like candy. They eat that, and then they grow, and they make products. So if we want to convert that into a process for making conversion for waste, we need to get that cell to not just eat that sugar, but to eat the Brussels sprout of things, right? The food, the waste, right? So how do we get it to eat the thing that it doesn't want to eat? Sometimes pretty tricky, right? And then get that to then convert to make new types of products. So this takes a lot of genetic engineering and efforts to be able to rewire those cells, and that's kind of the work that we do within our lab. So I'll showcase two quick examples of how we've tricked these cells, essentially, into wanting to consume waste products. So the first of which comes from olive oil. Okay, so first you're like, well, what's wrong with olive oil, right? We use that for food and cooking purposes. Well, it's the process of making olive oil. So the process of making olive oil requires the heavy washing of olives. And this creates a really very potent waste stream of olive oil mill wastewater processing water. And typically, unfortunately, that is just dumped into riverways. Right? It has a lot of organic content, so it can nutrify the water. It also has a lot of sugars, things like mannitol, that cells don't usually like to eat. So we needed to find a way to get cells to take that wastewater, extract out all the nutrients out of that, and then convert that into something else. And so we used a process that we call adaptive evolution to be able to go and take that wastewater, have cells that can then convert that into something that's a valuable product. In this case, we looked at producing things like biodiesel. So taking what would have been thrown away waste from food processing and convert that into a fuel. And we did that, and ultimately we're able to get cells that chewed up that wastewater component and converted that into a biodiesel product. And we were able to do that far better than the current or unevolved strains. So this is an example of how we can take a cell that normally wouldn't eat this material, it was a waste, and now can convert that into something that's going to be valuable, like a fuel to drive our cars. All right, well, the next waste comes from cooking. All right, so maybe people have ever had waste cooking oil before. Oh yeah, right? And so we just pour that down the drain, right? No, right? So waste cooking oil can have a big issue, right? So you can actually take this from deep fryers, and we just had Thanksgiving, so there might be a lot of fried turkey oil sitting around, right? And if people pour that down the drain, that can be a big issue, and this can wreak quite a bit of havoc. So this is what happens when fat begins to congeal in the pipes. It can cost tens of millions of dollars to break these apart. Austin Water does not want you doing this for sure, and they have the abominable grease blob that will, say it's all in all the advertisements there. It says, stop the grease blob, don't pour this stuff down the drain, because ultimately this is causing issues. This caused really large issues in a lot of metropolitan areas for wastewater facilities, especially in very infamous one in London, that was an extraordinarily large, almost iceberg worth of fats that was just sitting in the pipes. Okay, so what can we do with it? Well, obviously we can contain it and throw away in the trash, but is there some value that we can get out of that? And so we went with the same type of strategy as that olive oil mill wastewater and said, can we use those oils as a food source to be able to convert that into an upgraded type of fuel? And so we took that from a local restaurant and poured that into our bioreactors with our engineered cells, and ultimately we're able to get cells within a course of about a week that we're able to convert that waste cooking oil into a valuable product like a different type of fuel. So really showcasing the fact that something that we would have thrown away can actually be valuable. So it's the idea of taking trash and turning it into treasure. All right, but then there's a much larger source of trash, right? And that's of plastic. And there's nearly 400 million tons of plastic that will be produced this year. That's a really large number. So it's hard to think about what that number means. So how much is 400 million tons? So if we have a fully loaded tractor trailer truck, how many trucks do you think that would be to make 400 million tons? What is that? I heard a million. 8,900. 100 billion billion. Huh? 100 million. 80 million I've heard. So it's actually 11 million fully loaded tractor trailer trucks. So is that a fathomable number? Well, there's only less than 3 million trucks in the US. All right, so it's a lot of plastic. All right, how about airplanes? So if you think about these double-decker A380 airplanes, how many airplanes worth of plastic waste is that? 5 million. 1 million. 2 million. 2 million again. Whoa, popular number. 8 million. Right, so it's actually a little bit less again. So it's 700,000. You were close? Closest, we're not going over, right? So A380 airplanes, but only 250 actually exist on the planet. And again, this is how much plastic waste will be produced this year. All right, let's get it to people. How many people is that? Like the weight of people? There's 8 billion people on the earth, yeah. So how many people is it? 4 billion, 200 billion, 5 billion. All of them. It's all of them. The 8 billion, right? So it's the collective weight of every human on the planet worth of plastic being produced this year. And that number is increasing every year. And so this begins to get you a concept of just how large and what the scope of this problem is. So that's the negative side. The positive side, plastics are really important. Plastics are critical for our way of life. Plastics really have decreased the needs and demands of fuel on cars. So we've increased the fuel efficiency on cars because plastics can make them a lot lighter. Right? The same thing can be for airplanes. Airplanes are much more efficient because there's plastic in there. Right? Anything that happens in the medical industry, all the IV bags, everything that's used that's plastic there for sterilization has really revolutionized how medicine works. How many people have a cell phone? Right? How many people are lying? But things like cell phones or electronics, right, are all enabled by plastic. So if you didn't have plastic and there was all metal, that thing would heat up instantaneously and you'd have no battery life. Right? So plastics are really important, but we're also producing a lot of plastic. And so that becomes this challenge between the two. And plastic has very different type of lifelong aspects in terms of the impact. So plastics were started in 1907. So it was the first plastics were created then. So here we are today, 2024. So plastics that are produced today, so that 400 million tons, if that were just put into a landfill, that would be sitting around until the year 2524 to 3024, somewhere in that range. So that's a huge issue. Right? So we're going to have to think about how we deal with the end goal and end use of that plastic. Plastics also sit around for different amounts of time. So our plastic packaging for food is created, you get your food, you use it, you throw it away. Right? Plastics that go into manufacturing of cars sit around for sometimes a decade or two. Plastics that can go into our buildings can sit around for 50, 60 years. And then at some point in time, there's an end of life. Sometimes it's a short life, sometimes it's a long life, but there's an end of life for all that plastic. And sometimes you can repurpose this plastic. So think about the plastic milk jug that you can convert into a park bench or into a playground. But we don't need 400 million tons of benches or playgrounds every year, right? We need to figure out something to do with this. So one thing that we can do is recycle. So what % of plastic do you think is actually recycled? 9%. Some people were looking at that earlier, trivia. That's awesome. So it is 9%. Let's see how we get there. So if we look at that full amount of plastic that's produced and generated every year, about 15% of that is collected for recycling, and only half of that is actually accepted then at recycling facilities, and ultimately leading to 9% of waste that's recycled. So there's a problem there, right, just in terms of the closed loop aspect. But even if everything was recycled, we can't do that infinitely. You can't just take a bottle and recycle it over and over and over and over again and hope to get the same properties out of it. So there's a limited amount of times that things can be recycled. So if we look at all the different types of nomenclature for recyclable plastics, things starting with PET, how many times do we think PET can be recycled before it begins to disintegrate? 5, 8 or 9, 1, 7, 10, 100, 3. Perfect. So PET can be recycled only about 3 times before it loses that integrity. And then usually it gets spun into fibers and goes into polyester fiber and goes into clothing, and that usually ends up being the last place, or carpeting sometimes, that ends up being the last place for which plastic goes, for PET. So can't solve the problem with just recycling there. I answered it already. So for HDPE, that high density polyethylene, that can last for a lot longer. You can recycle that many more times, almost about 12 to 13 times, before that is no longer able to be mechanically recycled. How about PVC? So we use that in all the piping for water pipes and all. 32, 89, 294, we're really optimistic. 17, 1. I saw people put up 1. So you can only recycle that 1 time. And then what do you do with it? Right? You have to throw it away, right? And that has to sit for hundreds of years before it breaks down. So same thing for things like LDPE, so like the thin plastic bags, that can only be recycled about 1 time. For polypropylene, that can be recycled about 4. For polystyrene, that has only 1 time. And then all these other archaic ones that say like 7, which is like sometimes recyclable in your local facility, it's unknown, right? So there's not really a known pattern for those. So you can see that mechanical recycling isn't the solution either. You can't always repeat that. So as you can see, the problem is pretty broad, right? So the problem comes in terms of the use of that plastic, the disposal of the plastic, and the production of the plastic, disposal, the handling, is responsible for about 3.4% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So beginning to be a sizable chunk on there. So that's half the problem in terms of the actual end use of plastics. The other problem is actually using plastics. So, why do I have this orange here? To eat it, right? But expect it. So what do we see about this orange? Is there something special in this orange? It's orange. It has a sticker. It's compostable. What does that mean? It can be biodegradable, it can be compostable. So it has its own packaging. Right? It's almost the same size as that. Right? It comes in its own package. It's organic. You can make plastic out of the peels, right? You can do that with there. But you can also open it up. Does it take a long time to open up an orange? No. If you're a baby, yeah. But then you'll give it to your parents and it'll be fast, right? So if this is really easy to open, and it comes in its own package, why do we need to do this? No reason. People are lazy, right? So this is at a supermarket. Won't name which one. But you see this at multiple supermarkets. I've even seen pictures of people having peeled bananas that are then wrapped in plastic. Exactly. So, like we said, plastics are good for a lot of applications, but the overuse of plastics, not so much. Right? So we need to pick and choose where we're using plastic, for sure, to change that problem. So over time, plastic accumulates, though. It's not recycled. It's not put into landfills properly. And they're beginning to be large patches of garbage, large patches of plastic. And this is almost look like it's its own continent there, unfortunately. Right? But it's a floating pile of garbage in the Pacific Ocean. And you can see that this is just massive. You can see the impact of what's happening on the environment there. Right? So it's estimated that this great garbage patch has about 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic in it. So where do we think this plastic's mostly coming from? Well, humans, yes. But what activities? What do you think? Littering? Food? Plastic water bottles, plastic from everywhere. Use of plastic. The 91% that doesn't get recycled, right? So the major one actually for floating plastic on the ocean is mostly from fishing. So 50% of those pieces are actually from the fishing industry. So these are all the fishing nets and fishing pieces that are sitting there. So most of this other plastic goes to landfills and goes to other places, the ones that we use for our water bottles. But the stuff that we see on the ocean is just the impact of fishing on the ocean. So plastic, how do we actually get this? So when it's made chemically, it actually comes in this type of form that you can see here. So it's called plastic nurdles. So it's a weird word, right? So it's these little tiny pellets of plastic. And then these get melted and then processed into all the different things like this, right? So how many, it's like the jelly bean in the bottle thing. How many nurdles do we think it takes to make one bottle? 1,500, 4,000, a million, 100,000, 500,000, 1 million. All right, I heard a number though. I did hear it. 1,000. So 1,000 of these little tiny pellets, and if you had to count out 1,000, that's a lot. You'd start losing it a little bit. You know, pieces would fly around, right? It's kind of like glitter out of a jar. But 1,000 of those go to make one bottle. How about for a plastic bag? Oh, very big numbers. Like, think about the size between the two. 2,000, 4,000, 5,000, 2,000, 200. That's close. 300. Right? So the bag's a lot smaller, it's a lot thinner than that bottle, right? So it needs about 300. How about a yogurt container? I heard 100, 2,000, 1,300, 10, a million. About 400, right? I think the bag is about similar to the size of the yogurt container. So it takes a lot of these little pellets. And if you think about handling a lot of little small things, things happen. Right? Those pellets go everywhere. They get washed around. You have to transport those pellets. And so about 10,000 tons of these pellets are released into the environment every year. Right? So if you're walking on the ocean, you see at the beach, you see these little things that you think are oyster pearls. They're actually more not nurdles. And they can get into our food stream. Right? And this is the plastic, again, plastic that you can see. They're just small. Sometimes, because of how we have to handle them, there are disasters. Right? So this is a cargo ship off the coast of Sri Lanka in 2021 that caught fire, and it was transporting nurdles. And that one ship had about 2,000 tons of nurdles that were released. This is just poured onto the beaches and essentially killed off all the fish in that area. So just as the production of those nurdles, the production of the plastic has an impact again. But this is the impact we can see with the size of the particles, right? You can see these nurdles that are right here. The other thing that we can't see, as I said earlier, was the idea of things like microplastics. So these are smaller than what you can see with the naked eye. And this is getting into our environment as well. And so about 60% of the generation of microplastics come from just two activities that most of us do every day. What do you think they are? Laundry, I heard, is one. So that's actually the big one. Dishes. Showering. Huh? Staying alive. I'll give you a hint. Most of you came here by car or a truck, right? So driving. Right? So it's that friction of the tire on the road that's giving off little bits of microplastics. So this combination of just washing our laundry and driving contributes substantially to the amount of microplastics that are generated. So looking at just laundry for a second, so one load of laundry, so one basic load of laundry, something you think it's benign, nothing happens, the clothes are clean. But in reality, you generate about 700,000 individual particles of plastics. So everything that you see that's a polyester fiber or anything else like that that's a synthetic, polyurethane fibers, those are all plastics. And as they grind together in the washer and the dryer, they rub off a little bit. So it's about a gram, which at first you're like, that's not very much. But that adds up for every single time that someone's doing a load and every load that everyone's doing on the planet. And these are really small. And they pass through the water treatment facilities. So it's estimated that collectively, now again, tires and laundry and everything else that we do, every time we rub plastic together, every time something hits ground together, about 1.53 million tons per year of microplastics are released in the environment. Is that a lot? Is it not? It sounds like a lot, right? But we don't see it. So we don't know it's a problem. It's not the garbage patch, right? It's not the garbage that's in the landfill. We don't see this. But to put this into perspective, this is equivalent to if every person on the planet, now again, this is per year, right? So if every person on the planet this year were to take and throw in 29 plastic bags into the ocean. If every person threw 29 bags into the ocean, you would see it. But since they're microplastics, you can't. Right? So sometimes that impact that we're having, we don't see. And that's a challenge as well. So kind of talked about the challenges on plastics. So there are alternatives. So let's start to think about that a little bit. So what are alternatives? So we see that we can have a plastic bag at the grocery store, and we can think of alternatives to that. So let's think just on the amount it takes to produce these things. Okay, so it costs energy, costs water, there's CO2 that's released. So there's challenges with just the production of this. So I'm not talking about end of life, I'm just talking about production. So in terms of the amount of global warming and CO2 that's released to make that bag, that one, so thicker, the high density polyethylene bag, is equivalent to a paper bag that has to be used 3 times. It takes a lot of water and energy to make pure paper. Right? So you'd have to use a paper bag 3 times to be equivalent to what energy went into making that plastic bag. You need to use an LDPE bag, so the thinner ones, about 4 times. So the main alternative people like to use are cotton bags. You need to use that cotton bag about 131 times for it to be equivalent to that of that plastic bag. A lot of water resources go into making cotton. So just on that energy and greenhouse gas part, there's a balance between the two. So let's look at straws for a second the same way. So same type of principle. If you look just at the CO2 release and the energy, one polypropylene-based plastic straw is equivalent to using a paper straw 5 times. Most people laugh at that because usually you can't use a paper straw more than once, or even a half a time, right? But you'd have to use it 5 times for it to be equivalent to the greenhouse gases coming out of one bag. Metal straws need to be used 150 times. There's a lot of energy that goes into making a metal straw. And so when we see these, we know that there has to be some kind of balance in terms of the alternatives. So clearly we need a circular, sustainable solution. How do we go from this massive amount of plastic waste back into a green solution such that we can recircularize what we have? Put another way, wouldn't it be great if that 400 million tons was all we needed to make and we can just remake it easily every time? And we don't have to make more plastic. And so really it comes down to the fact that everything that we use at some point in time is single use. We throw it away. And so making a new material costs energy, costs resources, costs water. And then we use it. And then there's energy that's required to dispose of it. So if instead we can use biology, just like those examples that I showed for the waste cooking oil and the olive oil processing, if we can use biology to recircularize this, we can actually minimize the amount of energy that has to go in and minimize the amount of waste. So we want to close that loop. And so we started this with the idea of looking at PET. And PET being kind of the main plastic that's in things like water bottles and other types of containers. And kind of as I said at the beginning, everything that comes from oil. So oil is used as a resource to convert that into 2 different molecules of interest called terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol. Those molecules are kind of like little beads, and if you string those together, you can make that polymer, this material, what makes the nurdles, that then gets processed into the actual bottle or container. And so mechanical recycling pretty much just takes this, grinds it back up, and makes it back again. We were thinking, can we actually bypass this? If these are really beads on a string, can we just take the beads apart and then put them back together? Because you can keep doing that, kind of just like Lego bricks. Take them apart, put them back together. And so that was really the goal. How do we actually do this? Can we get a biological solution for enabling this? And nature actually beat us to the punch, right? So nature found a way. So in a water bottle recycling facility in Japan, people started to notice that little microorganisms were beginning to grow on the surface of the plastic. So these organisms were identified, and it was found that these organisms were actually chewing up really, really slowly, but chewing up this water bottle. And hidden in these cells were an enzyme that was able to take that PET and break that back down to those same starting points again. So that was that potential to be able to take this larger polymer and break it back down to the starting points and starting elements there. And it was all thanks to this enzyme called pave. This idea that this enzyme is able to literally unbead these strings that are together and allow us to then be able to put them together again afterwards. And so we wanted to harness this power of the enzyme. As I said, this is a really slow process. We want it to happen really quickly. So this is our native enzyme, kind of represented here by Pac-Man. And if this is kind of the waste, so something like the plastic, these enzymes are really specific. They'll bring in this particular compound, they'll change it or break it apart, and then slowly release it. But like I said, this is a really, really slow process. We have a lot of waste to deal with. We can't do this in a really slow process. We want a fast enzyme. So how can we engineer this through bioengineering to make this enzyme go much quicker through that process? Because that would allow us to go through and break apart this plastic much more easily. So we used what's called a machine learning based approach. So we wanted to go and think about this enzyme, our starting point and our ending point. How do we go from point A to point B? What are the changes that we need to make to ultimately engineer that enzyme to make it a fast one? And so for that, we started thinking about enzymes in general and looked at all different types of enzymes and started learning about what it takes to be a good enzyme. And this is through like machine learning type of approaches. And ultimately, that gave us the path of how to go from that poor enzyme into a superpowered enzyme. And ultimately, that gave us a couple of point mutations you can see as these highlighted residues on there that really supercharged this enzyme to work really quickly to break down this plastic. And so you can begin to see what happens here just in the course of hours. We go from, this is a microscopy image of the plastic, going to the fact that you can see the holes that are breaking through as this enzyme is literally chewing up this plastic and breaking it back down to its starting points. And so we went shopping, essentially, so we can go and get plastic from anywhere. So a lot of things are wrapped up in PET. So we took different food containers and bottles and packaging cartons from eggs that were left over. So all these different types of things that we can do from used plastic and convert that through our process. So we took this cookie container. This is the favorite one of the lab, just because the cookies were in there as well that were tasty. And then we took that plastic. We literally took a handful of plastic and cut out that huge chunk piece, put that into our enzyme solution. Waited a little bit of time and pulled it out. You can begin to see that now it's no longer a clear plastic. It has this opaque nature, and it's beginning to peel apart a little bit in the thinnest of the regions. If we wait a little bit longer, the thinnest of the spots have been degraded away, and we're left with the thickest parts. Wait a little bit longer, only the thickest parts are around. And then after that, there's nothing to take out because that plastic had completely broken apart. So we can see this visually on a much larger piece where we took the entire cookie container, put that into our enzyme, and it begins to eat apart at the thinnest of the regions. As time goes on, the thicker regions begin to be degraded more and more and more until we're left with absolutely no plastic left and all of our starting material. So those original beads that were used to put together to make that plastic. This is something that happened at near room temperature conditions in the course of hours, not the course of centuries. And then we can scale this up, and we can actually have a power that's more than just mechanical recycling. So if you take pieces of plastic that have colors in them, if you start to mechanically recycle that, you end up getting something that's just a mixture. It ends up being just a really dark gray plastic. And no one wants to drink water from a gray water bottle because you think it's the water, not the plastic. Right? So we need to deal with these more color PET components. So here, we took this container, we used our enzyme and broke that apart. We can separate away from the colorants. We can extract those original monomers that way from there. And then we can chemically repolymerize and recreate, and here's the little bit of an edge that you can kind of see on both of these here, the edge where we recreated that PET plastic. So we created that closed infinite loop to be able to take plastic, break it apart for PET, and put it back together. And this can be done infinitely compared to mechanical recycling, which again can only be done 3 times for this PET. So this allowed us to really bypass the challenges associated with oil and allow us to take the plastic that's been made and just keep reusing that for at least PET. So that has a lot of power, I think, right, for at least the PET plastic side of things. And so just that one organism opened up the door to being able to break down and recycle the PET plastic, I think now we have the potential to find organisms to begin to break down all other types of plastics as well. So it begins to unlock that piece of the puzzle there. And that's kind of what we sought out to do. So we started with a process where we went bioprospecting. It's kind of like going treasure hunting in trash for microorganisms. So we went to a compost facility where you could very clearly see plastic everywhere and went shopping, literally. So we took different samples trying to find microorganisms that were in there that could begin to break down these different types of plastics. And so we went through with that and kind of found organisms that not just can break down PET, but things that can begin to break down polyethylene, things that can break down PVC, things that can break down PMMA. So this is kind of like the acrylic plastics that are on kind of the barriers that were put up during COVID in supermarkets and all. and PHB, which is a more biodegradable plastic. So the potential is there to take those organisms now and begin to use those to break apart the plastic itself back to starting points. So really this idea that we can actually go from new material to used material, we can close that loop. And here's just an example and that from one of those other ones. This is actually on PE, where we start with that rich plastic. It's nice and smooth overall. We can begin to see that the microbes are beginning to eat that away. So I think that we're at that same starting point now for some of these other plastics, like we were at that plastic water bottle facility for PET. And so just really to close on that, this idea that everything we do leaves a footprint on our environment. Right? Every single thing that we do leaves that footprint. But the promise of biotechnology really has the ability to save our planet and reverse that footprint when the impact is both visible and non-visible. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of the major researchers who contributed to this work in my lab, as well as our funding sources. The ones who had major contributions on the projects are listed on here. And obviously would like to once again thank everyone for coming out here on a Friday. It was a cool night outside, so hopefully the hot science warmed you up with that. And I'd like to thank Jay and Angeline for pulling this program together, which is a wonderful program to bring people to campus to hear about the great science that's happening. And I'll leave you again with that kind of image and happy to open up the floor to questions. So thank you.
Questions for Professor Alper. So maybe you come out to the aisles here if you want to ask a question. Either aisle, we'll go back and forth. And whoever's in the aisle first will get the first question. Here you go.
All right, so it's wonderful that you've solved the technological challenges, the chemical challenges involved with biodegrading plastics. But what challenges remain from turning this into a larger scale thing, making this actually mainstream as opposed to traditional mechanical recycling?
Yes, that's a great question. And so there's a lot of challenge across the entire life cycle on there. So first off, plastic is a distributed problem. So people then have to bring that back together, right? So the redistribution of that and the sorting processes that have to happen in municipalities is definitely a big challenge. Getting that into the ethos for that, we don't just throw it all in one bin, we know how to separate that out so we can kind of run with this process. After that, the kind of challenge in terms of scale, talked about 400 million tons. How do you deal with that much waste, right? At what level does it make sense to do this at a smaller scale or a larger scale? And that's going to depend a little bit on the types of plastic. And the other big challenge is that most things aren't just one plastic. Even this water bottle has two different plastic components, the lid versus the actual bottle. So dealing with these multi-layer components is a big challenge. But I think biology has a big role, especially, as I mentioned, there's colored plastics, but also in multi-layer. Because enzymes in cells are very particular with what they chew up. So they can selectively pick out between the ones that they like and the other things that they don't want. And we can run the process that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. We'll take more questions here, but those of you who are not familiar, after the Q&A, we have a raffle. So hold on to your ticket that you brought in. We're going to raffle off some pretty remarkable prizes.
How much does it cost? How long will it be before it's equal to the cost of the original production of the plastic?
Okay, so I guess two answers to that question. I think the cost is not fully known, as this is something that has to still be scaled up. There are some companies that are looking at scaling this up. One in particular in France actually is already doing some of this type of technology with an enzyme. So I think we're beginning to get a sense of what that cost is. It's certainly going to be more than the cost of fresh virgin PE for PET. But again, that price of that fluctuates a little bit with the cost of oil. The process will be a little bit more expensive at the moment than mechanically recycled, because you then have to do the chemical polymerization also on that. So I think it's going to sit somewhere in this price point a little bit above that of recycled PET.
So when you're looking at this massive floating pile of plastic in our ocean, first of all, what is the majority? I remember you said about 50% of it comes from discarded fishing waste.
Yeah.
So what is the majority of that, the type of plastic it is? And do you think anytime in the future there will be an application of a biological enzyme or something to possibly start chipping away at this massive plastic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like I said, 50% is discarded fishing material, and that's usually that of nylon type materials in terms of how the fishing wires and fishing nets are made. And I think over time, people have been starting to explore the idea of how do you break down things like nylon. And there are enzymes called nylonases that have been discovered in nature. Again, really slow, but I think the potential is there to speed that up and eventually think about how that can be delivered. I think over time, one can think about either getting organisms that can begin to chew that up and adding that there, or specifically just going out and spraying some of that enzyme on that plastic as a way to begin to chew that up as well. So I think the future's there for that. The technology is just not there today.
So this reminds me of the tale of the cane toads in Australia, which were released in 1980 to help cull the cane beetle population that was destroying the economy there. Do you think, in your best opinion, would it be better for this enzyme and these organisms that have it to be employed in a super controlled environment before we release them, if that's the main goal, to release them in the wild and help them become a part of our natural global ecosystem?
Yeah, so it's a great question in terms of release, and I think there's a few plays at hand here. So one, enzymes have some limited life, right? So enzymes don't propagate themselves; they're not living entities. So I think the deployment of enzymes is much less of a detriment than something that was a self-sustaining organism. And so I think that's kind of where initial deployment would look in the environment would look like, as that being a deployed enzyme that has a finite life associated with it. At some point in time, it denatures and then it's just protein, essentially, at that point in time. Versus having an organism that can get out, that can begin to wreak havoc and degrade everything. So it's like the three little pigs don't make your house out of plastic, maybe, right? But you kind of have this kind of a challenge associated with that. So I think for organism-based processes, something that's going to be a collated plastic going to a facility makes most sense for that.
Are there any chemical byproducts created when these bacteria, plastic-eating bacteria, eat the bacteria, like carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases, things that are just also going to mess up our planet?
Yeah, so that's a great question on that. So for the enzyme itself, let's talk about that particular process for something like PET. So that enzyme is what's called an esterase, and that really just cleaves that ester bond. So the only thing that's created in that is just water. So nice and benign type of process on that. For an organism, and organisms that grow, there are different organisms, some of which will release some amount of CO2 as they grow, some of which actually use CO2. So there are ways to think about using something like a photosynthetic organism in conjunction with this, and maybe you have that dual property of both using some CO2 and breaking down that plastic. So I think there's some creative solutions that we can make once we kind of understand all of these pathways.
Wait, you already asked a question.
Oh.
So you can get in the back of the line. Sorry.
When did you become a scientist?
That's a great question.
That's a great question. I think you become a scientist the first day you ask the question, why? Right? Because that's why, right? That's the first part of being a scientist is just questioning things and thinking about, like, well, why is that the case? Why is that there? What else can I do? And I think that's the day you really become a scientist. And then eventually you'll find what question you want to answer. Right? And that's when you become someone who's really focused as a scientist. But your scientific exploration begins the first day that you say why.
Okay, so I too am a biomedical engineer, and I know about the problem of like microplastics that are now in our bodies and stuff because it has propagated up the food chain. And I'm curious, is there a way to engineer some sort of, either take the gene for these types of enzymes or somehow put these enzymes back into our bodies in a safe way, maybe even, transfect ourselves with those genes or whatever, but somehow put those enzymes in our bodies so that they can now digest those microplastics.
Yeah, to become a maybe that's the superpower that you want to create, is this idea of trying to be able to then break down the plastics. Then you can eat the plastic food, right, that's sitting around like the Fisher Price foods and, have a meal out of that. So I think that one's a little bit further off, partially because these enzymes, especially for this esterase enzyme, is really sensitive to the pH and it won't withstand the pH of the stomach acid. But I think there's ways to think about that. I think the challenge, though, is what happens with those byproducts. So we don't necessarily want things like terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol running around in our bodies, but at the same time, we don't want the microplastics. So I think there are unique solutions to think about on there, but I don't think that's ready for mainstream just today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, like, when you have like the molecules to make like that you put the plastic in that makes it turn how it was before, do you have to use a lot of them, or is it just a little bit that makes it turn back to how it was before?
Yeah, so it's pretty much the same amount. So if you put in
Great question.
this consigned thing, you get this size thing again. Yeah, so it's really just rebuilding it back up. So I said, so thinking about it as like kind of beads on a string. So if you took all the beads off, you'd then be able to put those beads back on.
My question is, what inspired you to become a professor?
So I was always interested in kind of just the idea of teaching and learning. I always enjoyed my classes. I studied hard all the time. I really found that fun. That was my good hobby. So I really kind of fell in love with that and then realized that you can actually have a lot of fun being a professor, because not only do you get the opportunity to teach and work with people, you get the opportunity to do exciting research and explore kind of unanswered problems. So that's what motivates me every day, is working with people, teaching, and being able to solve problems.
Thank you. Great question. There you go. You could ask us.
Are there any enzymes that break down multiple types of plastic?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are enzymes that can break down certain ones that are very close to each other. So things like polypropylene and polyethylene tend to look kind of similar molecularly. So that enzyme, that Pac-Man, right, sort of gets tricked a little bit because they look similar, so it can begin to chew that up. But then there's other plastics that look really different from that at the molecular level. So that Pac-Man, that Pac-Man is really specific for what it wants to eat. So it only eats the things that kind of fits into its mouth. So it has to kind of be sort of similar, and then it has some what's called promiscuity, but otherwise it's pretty specific.
So at the start of the talk, you mentioned plastics used for maintaining sterilization and medical equipment. And I know you had looked into plastics that have been colored. What about plastics that are tainted with things unsafe for human handling, body fluids, wastes, things like that? Could this enzyme be applied safely to those where they would be reusable again?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We have studied the idea of kind of dirtied plastics, right? So kind of what I showed on those pictures were nice, pristine plastics. We washed them off or cleaned them off really well. But in reality, going into even just plastic that comes out of the recycling bin is gunked up by everything else that was thrown in there, and dirty hands that threw the plastic away, or food residue. They're like, oh, that's good enough to recycle, throw that in there, right? So we have seen that there are certain things that can prevent that enzyme from working, mostly because it kind of coats the surface. But then we've also found in turn that there are ways to wash that plastic such that the enzyme can then be able to attack on it. And I think the same thing for some more of these kind of more medical or biohazardous type of components. Certainly you wouldn't want to necessarily immediately take that broken down plastic without a lot of purification before you put that into a water bottle, but you have the ability to kind of access that plastic and can be used for something else.
So the percentage of plastic we use, what percent of it ends up in the ocean, and is it going up or down over the past few years? Has it gone up or down over the past few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the amount of plastic that kind of goes out to the landfill, so it kind of goes from landfill, but then it also goes into the waterway, just kind of gets run off. It's a lot of rain it goes through. That amount is just increasing every year. And so that's the big challenge, not just the percentage, but also the number as well. Okay, I said that 400 million tons this year. Next year is going to be more. And next year is going to be even more. And so that overuse of plastic is causing more and more of it to go out into the environment. And I'd say that the one thing that is increasing also is the amount of that short-lived plastic, so like containers. Right? So the more we're using things that are only living on the shelf, like what goes around the orange, for example, right? If we're using more and more of that, that goes into the trash much faster. So that's why that number is increasing as well.
Here you go. All right. Tell me, you mentioned you use machine learning. Tell me more about that. What is it? Is it like neural network, random forest, etc.? I'm curious, what exactly were you doing with it? What was the architecture of it, etc.?
Yeah, so in particular for that type of architecture, that was a convolutional neural network that we had used on there. So really what that does is, kind of showed in that picture, we were studying and looking at all the different types of known proteins and kind of looking at how the arrangements of all those amino acids sit in those proteins and learned kind of what the average protein, if you will, looks like. And then we said, this enzyme is really slow. It's not a great average protein. Could we put things in there to make it look more like an average protein? And that began to identify residues that if we mutated it, could actually increase the stability of that enzyme. And then when the enzyme was more stable, it worked much quicker. Yeah.
Okay, so back to when you were talking about the ocean. It would take a long time to just take it out of, like, say, the Pacific garbage patch, but could you just, like, remove the garbage, like, on the ocean?
Yeah, and actually, that's a great question. A lot of companies and some investors are actually looking at this idea of going through it. And it's almost like if on a beach where they can rake the sand, they have these big instruments that are kind of just raking the top of the water to then be able to collect that type of material and trash. But then, of course, if you move it somewhere, then you end up creating not the Pacific garbage patch, but the, name your state, wherever you're dumping it on their kind of garbage patch, and then have to deal with it there. But at least it comes off of the ocean there. So some people are looking at that kind of mat type of approach. Other people are trying to think about how you can kind of put it almost like in a big floating dumpster that then you can deal with it there and break it down. And so the other thing that's to think about is that's all there, and it's going to take energy to go with a truck or go with a boat to get that and then bring it back somewhere. So we have to think about a solution that doesn't use a lot of energy also. Otherwise, we're going to create more pollution while cleaning up the pollution.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Sorry everybody, but Professor Alper will be happy to answer your questions after the talk too, but let's have the last 2 here.
So at the beginning, you talked about how only 9% of the plastics that are actually in the recycling bin get reused, reduced, and recycled. Mm-hmm. Do you know why only 9% of this whole 15% that they actually get is like recycled?
So that was 9% of the total.
Yeah,
so
like,
about half of the amount that's collected is actually rejected. And the reason is because facilities can't handle a lot of the types of plastics that are put into those facilities. And if they have a batch that has some contaminants in there, they'll just reject the whole batch because otherwise it can ruin their facility. And a lot of times, even things that are marked, especially for things like PET, even if it's marked as a number 1, but it's a thin film, most facilities can't handle that thin film, even though it was PET. Right? And they have to kind of throw that out, and they just opt to throw it away as opposed to kind of ruining their system. And so the specificity that happens with the recycling facility is a big challenge. And so there are people who are looking at making machine-based sorting. So even though when it comes to the facility, they'll machine sort it away so that it can keep the good stuff and not have to throw away as much. But that's a big challenge.
So like you said that the enzyme ate the waste, right? Mm. But like it can't just stay in them, right? So does it come out as waste? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the enzyme, it's that kind of that Pac-Man I said. So it kind of eats that apart and then it spits it back out. So that's how we got those beads on the string type of scenario. For the cells, so thinking of things like the waste cooking oil and the olive mill wastewater, so there, as you mentioned, they can't just store it up indefinitely. So it'll consume that, convert it to a product, and then spit that product out. So then we're able to then recollect that product from there.
Excellent. Thank you guys for your questions.
So as was mentioned, I'm happy to answer more questions afterwards, but I know people want to see if they won the raffle.
Want to see if you won the raffle, but let's thank Professor Alper for an amazing talk.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.